Do you remember when dinner had to stretch to feed a whole crowd, even when the pantry was nearly empty? Back then, cheap recipes weren't just clever, they were survival, passed from one frugal cook to the next. These dishes turned scraps into suppers, filling bellies and memories at the same time. Let's look back at 30 recipes that kept big families alive on tiny budgets. Cold meat gravy sandwich, post-roast leftovers, jiggly but beloved. The cold meat gravy sandwich is proof that thrift and comfort can share the same plate. Imagine a family roast from the late 1940s or early 50s, the kind that was the centerpiece of Sunday dinner. Once the plates were cleared and the last slices of meat carved, nothing went to waste. The drippings in the pan were whisked into a hearty gravy, poured generously over potatoes and biscuits that night. But the story didn't end there. Whatever gravy remained was poured into a dish, cooled overnight in the icebox, and transformed by morning into something remarkable. A savory, gelatinous slab that could be spread on bread and eaten cold. This sandwich became a midweek lifesaver for large families trying to stretch a single roast across multiple meals. Bread was cheap, abundant, and always on hand. A spoonful of cold gravy, sometimes studded with leftover meat shreds, could turn a plain slice of bread into something filling enough to keep you going through school, factory shifts, or farm chores. It wasn't fancy and certainly wasn't Instagram-worthy, but it carried the flavor of Sunday into Monday and Tuesday lunches. Children of the era have mixed memories of this creation. Some recall wrinkling their noses at the wobbling texture, while others fondly remember sneaking an extra sandwich when no one was looking. It symbolized more than just leftovers. It was a quiet celebration of resourcefulness, of making something from nothing and still managing to feed everyone at the table. In today's world of fast food and meal kits, the cold meat gravy sandwich has nearly disappeared, remembered only by those who grew up with it. Yet for those who taste it again, it's like opening a time capsule. One bite, and suddenly you're back in a modest kitchen where waste was unthinkable. Every scrap mattered, and love was measured not in lavish meals, but in the ingenuity to make them last. Hot dog sandwich. Split dogs on bread, cheap buns substitute. The hot dog sandwich may not sound like much today, but for families in the 1950s through the 1970s, it was a budget-saving staple. Picture a summer evening with the windows open, cicadas buzzing outside, and a kitchen bustling with hungry kids. A pack of hot dogs was cheap and fed plenty, but hot dog buns, those were a luxury. They went stale fast and cost more per serving than an entire loaf of sliced bread. The solution was simple. Split the hot dogs lengthwise, lay them across sandwich bread, and call it dinner. It wasn't gourmet, but it worked. Preparation was as flexible as the families who made it. On busy nights, the hot dogs might be boiled and patted dry. When a little more time allowed, they were fried in butter in a cast iron skillet, giving them crispy edges and an irresistible aroma that pulled everyone to the table. 2 slices of soft white bread, sometimes toasted, often not, cradled the split dogs, topped with mustard, ketchup, or whatever relish jar happened to be in the icebox. It was portable, filling, and cheap enough to serve a crowd without complaint. For many children, this sandwich was pure summer nostalgia. Eaten barefoot on the porch, juice from a shared watermelon waiting for dessert, and paper plates fluttering in the evening breeze. It was a meal made for picnics, quick lunches, and the chaotic magic of big family gatherings. The hot dog sandwich wasn't about presentation, it was about getting everyone fed and happy with what was on hand. Today, this humble creation has nearly vanished, overshadowed by gourmet dogs and artisan buns. But rediscover it and you'll find a certain charm in its simplicity. It's a reminder of a time when stretching a dollar was an art form and joy was found in the smallest substitutions, like bread standing in for buns, no questions asked. Molasses pull taffy, group activity dessert. Before candy bars came neatly wrapped in shiny foil, making sweets at home was both a necessity and a source of entertainment. One of the most beloved traditions, especially in rural communities and during the Depression, was molasses pull taffy. It wasn't just about the candy, it was about gathering everyone together in the kitchen, sleeves rolled curled up and turning a simple recipe into an evening of laughter and sticky hands. Molasses was the sweetener of choice because it was cheap, plentiful, and shelf-stable. Families who couldn't afford refined sugar relied on its deep, earthy sweetness to flavor desserts. To make the taffy, molasses was simmered with a little sugar or vinegar until it reached a thick, bubbling consistency that could stretch without breaking. Once poured onto greased plates and cooled just enough to handle, the real fun began. The pulling. Children and adults alike would butter their hands and take turns tugging the warm candy, folding it back on itself again and again until it turned from dark brown to a soft golden shade. The more you pulled, the lighter and chewier it became, and the kitchen filled with laughter as strands snapped and fingers stuck together. It wasn't a neat process. Aprons were smeared, hair caught stray threads, but that was part of the joy. Once finished, the glossy ropes of taffy were cut into bite-sized pieces, wrapped in wax paper, and tucked away for later, though few ever lasted more than a day. Beyond the taste, molasses pull taffy carried a sense of togetherness, a reminder that even in hard times, people found ways to celebrate. Today, this candy is rarely made outside of historical reenactments or nostalgic kitchens, yet it still embodies a timeless lesson. The sweetest memories often come from the simplest ingredients and the hands that make them. Fire-baked potatoes with powdered cheese. Topping. Few campfire foods are as satisfying, or as thrifty, as a potato roasted in the coals. During the 1940s and 50s, when family camping trips or backyard cookouts were inexpensive escapes from daily grind, fire-baked potatoes were the ultimate filler food. Potatoes were cheap, stored well without refrigeration, and could feed a crowd without fuss. The magic came not just from the roasting, but from what you sprinkled on top. Powdered cheese, the budget-friendly cousin of grated cheddar, usually pulled straight from a box of macaroni mix or bought in bulk from the corner store. The method was rustic but foolproof. Potatoes were scrubbed, wrapped in foil, or sometimes just tossed naked into the embers and left to bake slowly while kids ran around catching fireflies. By the time the skins were charred and the inside soft and steaming, the coals had cooled enough for careful hands to retrieve them with sticks or tongs. A quick slice down the center, a pinch of salt, and a generous dusting of powdered cheese turned each potato into a handheld feast. The cheese melted slightly on contact, coating the fluffy interior with its unmistakable salty tang. For big families on tight budgets, this was camping cuisine at its finest. No plates, no extra pots to scrub, just hearty food eaten with fingers and laughter. Even at home, this trick found its way into backyard fire pits and summer barbecues, stretching a single bag of potatoes into dinner for everyone. Modern palates might scoff at powdered cheese, accustomed to sharp artisanal blends and endless toppings. But one bite of that fire-baked simplicity, smoky skin and all, transports you back to a time when food tasted better because it was earned, cooked outdoors, shared with family, and savored under the stars. Depression-era bean soup. During the leanest years of the 1930s, when every penny mattered and store-bought luxuries were rare, bean soup became more than just a meal. It was survival in a pot. Cheap, filling, and endlessly adaptable, it relied on the most basic pantry staples: dried beans, water, salt, and whatever scraps of vegetables or bones could be spared. Families knew that with a little patience and a long simmer, even the humblest ingredients could transform into something comforting enough to carry them through another hard day. The process began in the quiet hours of morning. Beans, often navy or pinto, were soaked overnight if possible, then added to a pot of water with onions, maybe a carrot or two, and sometimes a ham bone saved from a holiday long past. The smell of simmering beans would fill the house slowly, promising warmth long before it was ready to eat. Salt and pepper were precious, but used sparingly to coax out flavor. By the end of the day, what emerged was a thick, hearty soup that could feed a large family for pennies, and often stretched into the next day's lunch with nothing more than a little extra water. Children of that era remember eating bean soup with cornbread or plain slices of bread, sopping up every drop so nothing went to waste. It wasn't fancy, but it was dependable. dependable, and there was comfort in its consistency. In kitchens where meat was rare and vegetables were whatever grew in the backyard, this soup was proof that you didn't need much to eat well enough to keep going. Today, Depression-era bean soup might seem almost too simple, overshadowed by modern recipes packed with spices and garnishes. But make it once and you understand its quiet brilliance. It's a dish born of necessity that now carries the flavor of resilience, a reminder that even the hardest times can yield meals worth remembering. Spam and rice casserole. Few dishes capture the post-war kitchen's mix of thrift and ingenuity, like spam and rice casserole. Born in the 1940s and popular well into the 1960s, this dish took two pantry standbys, canned spam and cheap white rice, and turned them into a filling, family-sized meal. It was the kind of recipe that appeared in church cookbooks and PTA newsletters, passed around with pride because it fed many mouths without straining the week's budget. The magic was in the simplicity. Spam, that pink block of preserved pork, was diced into cubes and browned in a skillet until the edges crisped and caramelized. Cooked rice, often left over from the previous night, formed the base. A can of condensed cream of mushroom or celery soup, another Depression-era staple that lingered in pantries for decades, was stirred in to bind everything together, sometimes with a splash of milk to stretch it further. The mixture was poured into a casserole dish, topped with breadcrumbs or shredded cheese if they were on hand, and baked until bubbling and golden. For big families, it was the ultimate one-dish wonder. Children loved its creamy texture and salty flavor. Parents appreciated that it required little more than a can opener and an oven. Leftovers reheated beautifully, making it as practical for weekday lunches as it was for Sunday suppers. And in communities where meat was still considered a luxury, Spam offered a taste of indulgence, savory, satisfying, and always ready when fresh meat was scarce. Today, Spam enjoys a curious revival, celebrated in Hawaiian musubi, or ironic foodie creations. But the humble Spam and rice casserole deserves its own comeback. It's a snapshot of mid-century kitchens, where canned goods and creativity met necessity. Bake it once, and you may find yourself surprised at how comforting it remains. A salty, creamy reminder that good food doesn't need to be complicated to be memorable. Potato and onion frittata. Long before brunch became a weekend indulgence with mimosas and avocado toast, the potato and onion frittata quietly sustained families through long work weeks and tight budgets. This simple egg dish, rooted in European peasant cooking and carried into American kitchens by immigrants, thrived during lean decades like the 1930s and 1940s. Potatoes and onions were cheap, hearty, and stored well through winter. Eggs, whether gathered from backyard hens or purchased sparingly, added protein and turned humble pantry staples into something that felt like a complete meal. The process was straightforward yet comforting. Potatoes were peeled and sliced thin, onions cut into half moons, and both were fried slowly in a skillet with a bit of fat. Bacon drippings if the family was lucky, or vegetable oil when money was tight. The vegetables softened and browned, releasing a sweetness that perfumed the entire kitchen. Beaten eggs were poured over the top, seeping into every crevice, and the whole skillet was left to set gently on the stove or finished in the oven if one was available. Some families flipped the frittata onto a plate halfway through, a careful maneuver that required both courage and steady hands. What emerged was a golden, savory pie that could be eaten hot for supper or cold the next morning, tucked into lunch pails or wrapped in wax paper for a farmer's field meal. It was endlessly adaptable too, boss. Bits of leftover cheese, wilted greens, or stray scraps of ham could be folded in to stretch flavor without adding cost. Today, potato and onion frittatas appear on trendy cafe menus, garnished with herbs and served by the slice. Yet their origins remain deeply humble, a dish born of necessity, not luxury. One bite still evokes that sense of homey resourcefulness, proof that good cooking often starts with the simplest ingredients and the wisdom to make them sing. Bread pudding with minimal sugar. In kitchens where every scrap scrap mattered, bread pudding was more than dessert. It was a small triumph against waste. During the Depression and wartime rationing years, sugar was precious, butter scarce, and even eggs sometimes had to be stretched. Yet stale bread, the one thing every household seemed to have, could be reborn with a splash of milk and just enough sweetness to make it feel like a treat. The version with minimal sugar wasn't meant to impress company. It was meant to soothe a family that needed comfort without extravagance. The process began with the heel ends and day-old slices no one wanted to eat. Torn into rough chunks, they were soaked in warm milk until soft, then enriched with a beaten egg or two if the budget allowed. A spoonful of sugar, rarely more, was stirred in alongside a pinch of cinnamon or nutmeg if someone had a tin lingering in the pantry. The mixture was poured into a battered baking dish and left to bake until puffed and golden, the edges caramelizing, while the center stayed soft and custardy. For children, it was often the closest thing to cake they'd see that week. The smell of warm bread pudding drifting from the oven promised a rare indulgence, even if it was served plain or with nothing more than a drizzle of watered-down syrup. Adults savored it too, not just for its taste, but for what it represented: frugality without sacrifice, sweetness pulled from scarcity. Today, bread pudding shows up in upscale restaurants, dripping with caramel and studded with chocolate. But there's quiet beauty in its humble beginnings. The minimal sugar version tastes of nostalgia, simple, honest, and born from a time when making do was an art form. One bite, and you understand why generations before us called it comfort food. Not because it was rich, but because it made hard days feel softer. Cabbage and noodle skillet. There's a certain magic in recipes that turn almost nothing into a meal, and few dishes capture that better than the cabbage and noodle skillet. Known in some immigrant communities as haluski or kapusta z makaronem, this humble dish crossed oceans with European families and found new life in American kitchens during the lean decades of the 1930s and 40s. Cabbage was cheap, hearty, and available year-round. Egg noodles were filling and easy to make at home or buy for pennies. Together, they created a skillet supper that fed big families without fuss. The method couldn't be simpler, which is part of why it endured. A head of cabbage was sliced thin, its pale green shreds tossed into a large skillet with onions and a bit of fat, lard, butter, or bacon drippings if they were lucky. Slowly, over gentle heat, the cabbage wilted and caramelized, transforming into something sweet and savory all at once. Meanwhile, egg noodles boiled in a separate pot, their soft strands later folded into the cabbage mixture with salt and pepper. In better times, a sprinkle of caraway seeds or a handful of crispy bacon might appear, but even plain, the dish was satisfying in its own right. Families loved it because it stretched so far. A single cabbage and a few handfuls of noodles could fill bellies around a crowded table, leaving just enough leftovers to fry up the next morning. For children, it was a comfort food they didn't even realize was born of necessity, warm, buttery, and familiar. Today, cabbage and noodle skillets are still beloved in pockets of the Midwest and Appalachia, often popping up at church potlucks or family reunions. In an age of trendy grain bowls and expensive meal kits, this dish stands as a quiet reminder. Sometimes the most memorable meals are the ones made with the least, crafted with patience and care in the humblest of kitchens. Lentil loaf. Long before plant-based eating became trendy, lentil loaf quietly fed families who couldn't afford much meat, or any at all. It rose to prominence during the Great Depression and saw renewed life in the 1970s when frugal living and back-to-the-land movements revived interest in hearty vegetarian meals. For households pinching pennies, lentils were a gift. Cheap, protein-rich, and endlessly adaptable. Turned into a loaf, they mimicked the comfort of meatloaf without the cost, earning a spot at countless dinner tables where thrift was both necessity and habit. The recipe was straightforward but satisfying. Dried lentils were simmered until soft, mashed slightly, and combined with whatever binding ingredients were available: bones, breadcrumbs, rolled oats, or day-old rice. Chopped onions, grated carrots, and a bit of tomato paste or ketchup added flavor and moisture. Seasonings varied widely widely. Some cooks used sage or thyme for a holiday-like aroma, while others leaned on Worcestershire sauce or a splash of soy to mimic the umami of beef. The mixture was pressed into a loaf pan, brushed with a thin layer of ketchup or gravy, and baked until firm enough to slice. Families loved lentil loaf, not just for its affordability, but for its versatility. It could be served hot with mashed potatoes, eaten cold in sandwiches, or reheated for lunches later in the week. Children might not have realized they were eating something meatless, especially when the loaf was dressed with the same sides as its beef counterpart, but parents appreciated that it filled plates without emptying wallets. Today, lentil loaf enjoys a quiet resurgence among budget-conscious cooks and vegetarians alike. Modern versions add nuts, fresh herbs, or fancy glazes, but the heart of the recipe remains the same, making something hearty and nourishing out of the simplest pantry staples. One bite and you taste history, proof that good food doesn't need luxury, just a bit of creativity and a hot oven. Dandelion salad from Victory Gardens. In the days of Victory Gardens, when every scrap of soil was turned into a food source and ration books dictated what ended up on the dinner table, dandelion salad was a symbol of frugality and resourcefulness. What most people consider a weed today was once a prized ingredient, growing wild in backyards and vacant lots free for the taking. Families learned to see past its stubborn roots and bitter leaves, transforming it into a springtime dish that promised both nutrition and the thrill of gathering food with your own hands. The process was as simple as the times demanded. Tender, young dandelion greens were foraged before the flowers bloomed. When their flavor was at its mildest, they were rinsed thoroughly, sometimes twice, to remove grit and dressed with whatever a family had on hand. A splash of vinegar or lemon juice, a pinch of salt, maybe a drizzle of bacon drippings, or a crumble of hard-boiled egg turned those humble leaves into something worthy of the supper table. For many, it was the first taste of fresh greens after a long winter of canned vegetables and root cellar staples. Dandelion salad carried more than just vitamins. It held the quiet victory of making do. Children would help pick the greens, baskets in hand, turning what might have felt like a chore into a game. Adults took pride in serving something fresh and seasonal without spending a dime, proof that thrift could be beautiful. Today, dandelion greens are sold in upscale markets and praised for their antioxidants, yet few realize how deeply tied they are to wartime kitchens and backyard gardens. Reviving the dish feels almost radical, a reminder that the line between weed and food is thin and that sustenance often grows closest to home. In every bite lies a lesson from the past, one of patience, resilience, and finding abundance where others see nothing at all. Cornmeal mush and molasses. Cornmeal mush and molasses is one of those dishes that perfectly illustrates how American families weathered lean years with grit and creativity. At its core, it was nothing more than cornmeal, water, and a pinch of salt, cooked into a soft, porridge-like consistency, humble enough to be breakfast, dinner, or anything in between. But when topped with molasses, that earthy sweetness transformed it into comfort food, turning a meager pantry staple into something children looked forward to at the table. This dish dates back to pioneer days and carried through the Great Depression, especially in rural communities where cornmeal was plentiful and cheap. Preparing it required no special equipment, just a sturdy pot and steady stirring to prevent lumps. Families would simmer the cornmeal until thick, sometimes letting it cool in a pan to slice and fry later in bacon drippings for a heartier meal. Molasses, affordable and widely available, provided the sweet note that elevated an otherwise plain dish, its deep caramel flavor masking the absence of butter, milk, or sugar. For many children, this was their first introduction to sweetness, a drizzle of molasses swirling into golden mush, staining it a deep amber, and perfuming the air with a scent both bitter and sweet. Parents appreciated its frugality. One bag of cornmeal could stretch across multiple meals, and molasses stayed good on the shelf for months. It filled stomachs without emptying wallets, which was all most families could ask for during hard times. Today, cornmeal mush and molasses is rarely seen outside historical reenactments or or nostalgic kitchens, overshadowed by trendier breakfast foods. Yet it deserves a quiet revival. Its simplicity is grounding, its history humbling. One spoonful connects us to generations who understood that comfort doesn't come from extravagance, but from making the most of what you have and somehow making it delicious. Leftover meat gravy pie. Leftover meat gravy pie was born in kitchens where waste wasn't an option and creativity was as essential as salt. During the Great Depression and well into the post-war years, roasts were a rare treat, and every scrap, from the tiniest shred of meat to the drippings congealed in the bottom of the pan, had to be stretched into as many meals as possible. That leftover gravy, rich with flavor and often studded with bits of beef or pork, became the base for a pie that was equal parts thrift and comfort. The process was wonderfully forgiving. Whatever gravy remained from Sunday dinner was collected and chilled, thickening overnight into a savory gel. By Monday or Tuesday, it was spooned into a simple pastry crust, often homemade, sometimes store-bought if a family could spare the cost. Potatoes, carrots, or onions were added if they were available, though many versions featured only gravy and a handful of meat scraps. A second crust, or simple lattice, topped the pie, sealing in the filling before it baked to golden perfection. When it emerged from the oven, the aroma filled the house with the promise of another hearty meal, even if it was cobbled together from remnants. The filling bubbled gently, transforming humble drippings into something that felt celebratory. Children rarely cared that it was leftover. To them, it was just pie, and pie always felt special. Today, leftover meat gravy pie is nearly forgotten, replaced by modern pot pies or frozen dinners, but it deserves to be remembered for what it represents: resilience, resourcefulness, and the ability to turn scraps into sustenance. Make it now, and you'll taste more than gravy and pastry. You'll taste the story of families who endured hard times with ingenuity, feeding not just their stomachs, but their spirits. Fried bologna sandwich. The fried bologna sandwich is one of those foods that never tried to be fancy and never needed to be. It rose to prominence in the mid-20th century, when bologna was inexpensive, widely available, and most importantly, versatile. For big families on tight budgets, a single package could stretch across several meals, especially when paired with the ever-present loaf of white sandwich bread. Frying it transformed the humble cold cut into something far more flavorful. A quick trick that home cooks swore by to make lunch or dinner feel like more than just scraps. The ritual was as simple as it was satisfying. Bologna slices were scored with little cuts to prevent them from puffing up in the pan, then seared in a bit of butter or bacon grease until the edges curled and browned. That brief encounter with heat deepened the flavor, coaxing out a smoky aroma that filled the kitchen in seconds. Once crisped to perfection, the slices were layered onto soft bread, sometimes toasted, sometimes not, and dressed with whatever condiments were on hand: mustard, mayonnaise, or even a swipe of ketchup for the kids. A slice of American cheese, if the budget allowed, melted beautifully against the warm meat. For many children, this sandwich became a lunchtime favorite, wrapped in wax paper and tucked into school bags. For adults, it was quick, reliable, and comforting, proof that good flavor didn't need an expensive cut of meat. The fried bologna sandwich even carried a sense of pride, a meal that tasted better than it had any right to given its humble ingredients. Today, the sandwich enjoys a nostalgic revival in diners and food festivals, often reimagined with artisan bread and fancy pickles, but at its heart, it remains the same. A no-nonsense classic that turns an ordinary cold cut into something warm, familiar, and undeniably satisfying. Tuna and crackers snack plate. The tuna and crackers snack plate is a relic of mid-century practicality, born in an era when quick lunches had to be cheap, filling, and portable. Canned tuna, which gained popularity during the 1940s, rice, thanks to wartime rationing and advances in food preservation, became a pantry hero for families trying to stretch their protein dollars. When paired with an unassuming sleeve of saltine crackers, it offered a meal that was equal parts thrifty and satisfying, perfect for after-school snacks, factory lunch breaks, or summer picnics where simplicity reigned. Preparation was as straightforward as opening a can. Tuna was drained and flaked into a bowl, sometimes mixed with a spoonful of mayonnaise or a splash of pickle juice if either happened to be on hand. On leaner days, it might be served plain, seasoned only with salt and pepper. Families spread the tuna onto crackers for tidy little bites, or more often simply piled it high and ate with fingers, crumbs scattering across kitchen tables covered in oilcloth. In homes where feeding many mouths mattered most, this was food that stretched without fuss. There was an unpretentious charm to the snack plate. It wasn't a recipe so much as an assembly, yet it held a place in countless childhood memories. Kids loved stacking cracker towers topped with tuna. Adults appreciated its speed and no-cook ease. It could serve as a light supper on hot days when no one wanted to turn on the stove, or double as a lunch for farmhands heading back into the fields. Today, tuna and crackers linger mostly in nostalgic lunch boxes or camping trips, eclipsed by pre-packaged snack packs and fancier charcuterie boards. But revisit it, and you'll find the appeal hasn't faded. It's salty, savory, and endlessly comforting. In every bite is the reminder that some of the best meals don't require cooking at all. Just a can opener, a handful of crackers, and the wisdom to keep things simple. Bisquick Drop Biscuits.
Hey, I'm John Cannell, and today on Preppy Kitchen we're making some quick and easy drop biscuits. So let's get started.
Bisquick Drop Biscuits are the definition of kitchen ease, the kind of recipe that rescued busy home cooks from scratch baking without sacrificing comfort. First introduced in the 1930s as part of General Mills' push to make baking in a hurry possible, Bisquick revolutionized weekday meals. For families coming out of the Depression, the mix felt almost magical. Flour, leavening, fat, and salt all combined in one box, ready to turn into biscuits, pancakes, or dumplings at a moment's notice. The drop biscuit version was especially beloved because it skipped the kneading and rolling that traditional biscuits demanded. A cook simply stirred Bisquick with milk until the dough came together, then dropped spoonfuls onto a baking sheet. Rough-edged and rustic, they baked up golden on the outside and tender inside in under 15 minutes. Perfect for weeknight dinners or unexpected company. Their craggy tops were practically made for soaking up gravy or butter, and kids loved peeling them apart layer by layer while they were still warm. These biscuits became a fixture at breakfasts and suppers alike, appearing alongside fried chicken, country ham, or even bowls of bean soup. In leaner households, they served as the star of the meal, split open and drizzled with honey, or served with nothing more than a pat of margarine. Their convenience also made them popular at church potlucks and holiday tables, where time and energy were already stretched thin. Today, Bisquick Drop Biscuits remain a nostalgic comfort food, even as scratch baking has returned to popularity. There's still something deeply satisfying about stirring together a few ingredients and pulling hot biscuits from the oven minutes later. They embody the mid-century promise of modern convenience while carrying the taste of home, simple, warm, and unfussy. One bite, and you understand why generations have kept that yellow box in their pantry, ready to turn an ordinary meal into something special. Macaroni and cheese with powdered cheese. Macaroni and cheese.
This entire pasta dish, this entire macaroni dish, can be just as fancy, just as cheesy, just as good, have that baked quality that everybody knows and loves.
Macaroni and cheese made with powdered cheese is the dish that defined comfort food for countless mid-century families. When boxed mac and cheese first appeared in grocery stores during the 1930s and gained traction in the 1940s, wartime years, it felt like a miracle. Pasta and sauce in one affordable package, ready to feed a family in minutes. Powdered cheese, shelf-stable bright orange, and a far cry from fresh cheddar, became a pantry hero, transforming plain elbow macaroni into something creamy and indulgent with almost no effort. The process couldn't be simpler, which was its greatest appeal. A pot of macaroni boiled on the stove stove while the cheese packet waited patiently on the counter. Once drained, the pasta was tossed back into the pot with a splash of milk and a pat of butter if available. The powdered cheese dissolved into a vivid sauce, clinging to every curve of the noodles and perfuming the kitchen with its unmistakable tang. In less than 10 minutes, dinner was served, cheap, filling, and universally loved by children. During lean times, boxed mac and cheese often served as the centerpiece of a meal rather than a side. Parents might stir in a can of tuna, leftover hot dogs, or frozen peas to stretch it further. Its bright color and mild flavor made it especially appealing to picky eaters, and the low price ensured it was always in the cupboard for emergencies. Today, powdered cheese macaroni has become both nostalgic and controversial. Foodies debate its processed nature, yet for many, one forkful transports them back to childhood, sitting at a formica table, swinging legs under a vinyl chair, and savoring a bowl of pure comfort. It's a dish that proves convenience can leave lasting memories, and that sometimes the simplest foods hold the deepest. Homemade peanut butter sandwiches.
Today I'm going to be making a very simple recipe: peanut butter and mayo in a sandwich.
Few foods are as universally tied to childhood memories as the homemade peanut butter sandwich. Before peanut butter became pre-mixed and sweetened in neat plastic jars, it was often sold unsalted or freshly ground at local grocers, sometimes separating into layers of oil and solids that required a good stir. In the early to mid-20th century, this humble spread was celebrated for its affordability and protein, making it a staple in lunch pails and after-school snacks for big families trying to stretch every penny. The beauty of the homemade peanut butter sandwich was its adaptability. At its simplest, it was just fresh bread and a thick swipe of peanut butter. No jelly, no extras. Families with more to spare might drizzle honey, add sliced bananas, or dust the sandwich with a pinch of sugar for a treat. During leaner times, the peanut butter itself might be thinned with syrup or mixed with margarine to make it go further. A quiet act of thrift that didn't diminish the comfort it provided. These sandwiches weren't just convenient, they were filling enough to fuel long school days, farm chores, or factory shifts. Parents loved that peanut butter required no refrigeration and lasted far longer than perishable meats or dairy, while children loved the sticky sweetness that clung to the roof of their mouths. Packed in wax paper or tucked into tin lunch boxes, they became the dependable standby of countless American families. Today, peanut butter sandwiches still hold their place at the table, though they've evolved into gourmet versions with artisan bread and small batch spreads. Yet the essence remains the same: a quick, nourishing bite that carries generations of nostalgia. One taste can transport you back to simpler times, sitting on a porch step in summer, crumbs on your knees, and the sense that life's best comforts often come from the simplest ingredients in the pantry. Stewed tomatoes on toast. Stewed tomatoes on toast is one of those dishes that sounds impossibly plain until you taste it, and suddenly you understand why it endured for generations. Born of lean times, especially during the Depression and wartime rationing, this meal made use of what families almost always had on hand: garden tomatoes put up in jars and yesterday's bread. Together, they became breakfast, lunch, or supper, depending on what the day demanded. A quietly resourceful meal that stretched the pantry without feeling meager. The process was wonderfully unpretentious. Tomatoes, fresh in summer or canned from the previous harvest, were simmered slowly with onions, salt, and a hint of sugar to balance their acidity. A splash of vinegar or a pat of butter, when available, added depth. As the mixture thickened into a rustic stew, bread slices were toasted or even fried in drippings, ready to act as both plate and sponge. The moment the tomatoes hit the toast, their juices soaked into every crumb, softening the edges while leaving the crust sturdy enough to hold its shape. Families loved this dish for its versatility. A pinch of dried herbs, a leftover slice of bacon, or a dusting of black pepper could make it feel new each time. It was just as welcome at a hurried breakfast as it was at a late-night supper after long hours in the field or factory. Children often grew up thinking of it as comfort food, unaware that it was, in reality, born from necessity. Today, stewed tomatoes on toast has nearly vanished from modern tables, replaced by avocado or elaborate brunch creations. But those who revive it often find themselves surprised by its charm. It's proof that the simplest combinations, ripe tomatoes and warm bread, can carry the weight of memory, transforming thrift into timeless comfort with every bite. Fried eggplant with saltines. Fried eggplant with saltines is one of those Depression-era creations that turned scarcity into something unexpectedly delightful. When breadcrumbs or flour were too precious to spare, families reached for whatever they had, often a sleeve of saltine crackers hiding in the pantry. Crushed into coarse crumbs, they became the perfect coating for slices of fresh eggplant, transforming a humble garden vegetable into a dish with a golden, satisfying crunch. The process was simple but felt almost indulgent. Eggplant, plentiful in summer gardens, was sliced thin and lightly salted to draw out excess moisture. Meanwhile, saltines were crumbled by hand or rolled under a glass until they resembled rough meal. The slices were dipped in beaten egg or even a splash of milk, then pressed into the cracker crumbs and fried in hot fat. Bacon drippings in frugal households, vegetable oil in later decades. The result was a crisp exterior that gave way to tender, almost creamy eggplant inside, a contrast that made the dish beloved at family tables despite its humble origins. For many, this dish was more than just a way to use up vegetables. It was a taste of summer and a memory of home gardens tilled by hand. Kids might not have been thrilled about eggplant on its own, but coat it in saltine crumbs and fry it golden, and suddenly it was something worth reaching for. Adults appreciated that it required little more than what was already on hand. No special trips to the store, no expensive ingredients, just clever cooking. Today, fried eggplant often appears cloaked in panko or paired with parmesan in upscale recipes, but the saltine-coated version carries a different charm. It's a reminder of a time when resourcefulness defined the menu, when even the simplest cracker could turn a vegetable into comfort food. One bite, and you taste the thrift and ingenuity that fed a generation. Rice and tomato soup. Rice and tomato soup is the
Well, this is a great little recipe, only has a handful of ingredients, and it will guarantee you to have a fantastic filling meal on the table in less than 15 minutes. It's tomato and rice soup on the One Pot Chef.
Rice and tomato soup is the kind of dish that feels like it's always been there, quietly feeding families through hard winters and lean paychecks. It rose to prominence during the Depression and wartime years, when fresh produce was scarce, but jars of home-canned tomatoes and sacks of rice were pantry staples. This was soup at its most elemental, no frills, no fuss, yet somehow deeply satisfying, proving that comfort doesn't require a long ingredient list. The method was straightforward. Tomatoes, fresh or canned, were stewed with water or broth, seasoned simply with salt, pepper, and perhaps a pinch of sugar to soften their acidity. Rice, cheap and filling, simmered directly in the pot until tender, thickening the broth into something heartier than its parts. Some cooks added a pat of butter or a splash of milk for richness. Others stirred in bits of leftover meat or vegetables when they were lucky enough to have them. But most often, it remained plain, a humble pairing of grain and tomato, nourishing in its simplicity. Families loved it for more than its thrift. Rice and tomato soup was dependable, the kind of meal that could stretch to feed one more person at the table without complaint. Children slurped it from enamel bowls after school. Adults warmed themselves with it after long days in the fields or factory. It was equally at home as a quick weekday supper or the first course at Sunday dinner, bridging the gap between scarcity and satisfaction. Today, rice and tomato soup has been overshadowed by creamier bisques and trendy grain bowls, but it deserves to be remembered for what it is: a dish born of resilience. One spoonful transports you back to a simpler time, when a pot of simmering tomatoes and a handful of rice could transform an ordinary evening into quiet comfort, proof that the best meals often come from the humblest of kitchens. Oatmeal pancakes. Oatmeal pancakes.
I absolutely love eating pancakes for breakfast. It's one of my favorite things. That's why I love these oatmeal banana pancakes. It's so healthy. We're not using any flour and no granulated sugar whatsoever in this recipe.
Oatmeal pancakes were a quiet hero of frugal breakfasts, a dish that transformed pantry staples into something that felt like a treat. Long before health trends touted oats as a superfood, they were simply cheap, filling, and endlessly versatile. During the Depression and wartime rationing years, families leaned on oats not just for porridge, but to stretch scarce ingredients like flour and eggs. When mixed into pancake batter, they added bulk and heartiness, turning a modest breakfast into something that could carry a person through farm chores or a long school day. The process was uncomplicated, which suited the times. Rolled oats were soaked briefly in milk or water to soften, then folded into a batter of flour, eggs, and a pinch of baking powder. Sweetness was optional, a spoonful of sugar or a drizzle of molasses if the pantry allowed. The griddle hissed as ladles of batter hit the hot surface, releasing the nutty aroma of oats, mingling with toasty edges. Each pancake emerged slightly denser than its white flour cousins, with a chewiness that felt rustic and satisfying. For many families, oatmeal pancakes were more than breakfast. They were a strategy. They used what was on hand, stretched the food budget, and minimized waste. A single pot of oats could serve as porridge one day and pancakes the next, reinvented with little more than a hot skillet. Children often topped them with whatever sweetener was available, syrup if they were lucky, a sprinkle of sugar, or even applesauce from the cellar. Today, oatmeal pancakes have found new life in modern kitchens, praised for their wholesome texture and hearty flavor. But their origins lie in necessity, not trendiness. One bite carries you back to kitchens warmed by cast iron stoves, where thrift met ingenuity, and the simplest meals often became the most beloved. Root vegetable hash. Root vegetable hash.
It's like a combo type of a dish. It has root vegetables. So I have some potatoes, some carrots, and some sweet potatoes. And we're going to make a hash out of it.
Root vegetable hash is the kind of dish that thrives on adaptability, a meal born from whatever the garden or cellar had to offer. During the Depression and throughout wartime rationing, this skillet favorite made frequent appearances on breakfast tables and supper plates alike. Potatoes were usually the anchor, but carrots, turnips, parsnips, or rutabagas all found their way into the mix, each adding its own earthy sweetness. It was a recipe that wasted nothing. Bruised vegetables, knobby ends, and even leftover scraps were all fair game. The preparation was unpretentious, but deeply satisfying. Vegetables were diced small enough to cook quickly, then fried in a hot skillet with whatever fat the family had on hand. Lard, bacon drippings, or a bit of butter if they were lucky. Onions were almost always included, softening into golden ribbons that flavored the whole pan. Salt and pepper were the primary seasonings, though a pinch of dried herbs or a dash of vinegar sometimes made an appearance, especially in immigrant kitchens where old-world flavors lingered. The vegetables browned and crisped at the edges, their sweetness intensifying as they cooked, while the centers stayed tender and comforting. Families loved root vegetable hash for its versatility. It could be eaten plain as a main dish, paired with eggs for breakfast, or stretched into dinner by topping it with leftover gravy or bits of cooked meat. Its humble ingredients meant it was always affordable, and its one-pan preparation made cleanup almost effortless, a blessing in homes already stretched thin. Today, root vegetable hash has been rediscovered by brunch menus and food blogs, often dressed up with fresh herbs or poached eggs. But the heart of the dish remains unchanged. It's still about making something hearty and flavorful out of the simplest ingredients. One forkful carries the quiet ingenuity of past generations, proving that comfort can come from the humblest roots. Kidney bean stew. Kidney bean stew is one of those quiet, dependable dishes that kept families fed through some of America's leanest decades. It's simple, hearty, and endlessly forgiving. The kind of recipe that can be stretched to feed a crowd or pared down to just what you have on hand. In the 1930s and 1940s, dried Dried beans were a lifeline, inexpensive and shelf-stable, soaking overnight in enamel bowls before being simmered into nourishing meals that tasted far richer than their humble origins suggested. The method began with patience. Kidney beans, soaked to soften them, were simmered slowly in water or broth until tender. From there, whatever aromatics the pantry could spare were added: onions, carrots, celery, or perhaps a bay leaf saved from a previous holiday roast. Tomatoes, whether fresh or canned, were a common addition, lending body and tang to the stew. Seasonings were basic: salt, pepper, and maybe a pinch of paprika or chili powder, but the long, slow cooking transformed everything into a thick, savory pot of comfort. For families scraping by, kidney bean stew was more than just dinner. It was strategy. It could be served plain with cornbread, ladled over rice to stretch it further, or bulked up with scraps of meat when they were available. Leftovers often tasted better the next day, making it a practical dish for busy households where nothing went to waste. Today, kidney bean stew is often overshadowed by chili or more elaborate bean dishes, but its charm remains undeniable. It's unfussy and nourishing, proof that good food doesn't require expensive ingredients or complicated techniques. One spoonful carries echoes of kitchens where thrift met resilience, where a pot of beans bubbling on the stove signaled not hardship but resourcefulness and care. Sweet potato biscuits. Sweet potato biscuits are one of those recipes that feel like a warm handshake from the past, humble, comforting, and rooted in tradition. Popular in the South and embraced by frugal cooks across America during the Depression and wartime years, they took an inexpensive staple, sweet potatoes, and transformed them into tender biscuits that were as practical as they were delicious. By blending mashed sweet potatoes into simple biscuit dough, families stretched their flour, added natural sweetness, and created a side dish that worked equally well at breakfast or supper. The process began with boiled or baked sweet potatoes, mashed until smooth and cooled slightly. They were folded into a mixture of flour, fat, lard, butter, or even shortening, and a bit of leavening, forming a dough that was softer and slightly more golden than traditional biscuits. Some cooks added a spoonful of sugar or cinnamon for warmth, while others kept them plain to better pair with savory meals. The dough was patted out, cut into rounds, and baked until puffed and lightly browned, their aroma filling the kitchen with a sweetness that hinted at comfort without extravagance. Sweet potato biscuits were beloved not just for their thrift, but for their versatility. They could be split and buttered for breakfast, drizzled with molasses as a treat, or served alongside soups and stews to round out a meal. In homes where meat was scarce, a basket of these biscuits on the table felt like abundance, their soft crumb and subtle flavor bringing cheer to even the simplest suppers. Today, sweet potato biscuits appear on holiday tables and in gourmet bakeries, often glazed or paired with honey butter. Yet their charm remains in their modest origins, a testament to the creativity of past generations who knew how to turn a root vegetable and a handful of flour into something unforgettable. One bite still carries that quiet ingenuity, reminding us that true comfort food is born of both necessity and love. Homemade Jell-O with fruit bits. Homemade Jell-O with fruit bits was a marvel of mid-century kitchens, a dessert that felt both playful and thrifty. In the years following the Great Depression and through wartime rationing, gelatin became a pantry staple thanks to its low cost and endless versatility. A box of flavored powder or a tin of unflavored gelatin could transform even the most meager ingredients into something bright and jiggly, offering a touch of cheer when budgets were tight and fresh fruit was a rare treat. The process began with boiling water and a packet of gelatin. Strawberry, lime, or orange were household favorites. Once dissolved, cold water was added to help it set, and that's where the magic began. Little bits of fruit, canned or fresh, were folded into the mixture before chilling. Pineapple chunks, banana slices, grapes, or berries suspended mid-wobble turned a simple dessert into a colorful mosaic. For children, the floating fruit was half the fun. It felt almost like a treasure hunt with every spoonful. playful. This dessert's charm went beyond its appearance. It was endlessly adaptable to whatever was on hand. Canned fruit cocktail for special occasions, fresh garden strawberries in summer, or even grated carrots and pineapple in church supper salads. It required no fancy equipment, set beautifully in glass dishes or enamel pans, and could be served at birthdays, Sunday dinners, or potlucks with equal ease. Today, homemade Jell-O has fallen out of fashion, often dismissed as retro kitsch. But for those who grew up with it, one bite can transport them back to simpler times. Kitchens where icebox trays clinked, mothers stirred bowls with wooden spoons, and kids peeked eagerly into the fridge to see if it had set. Its wobbly charm endures, reminding us that joy in food doesn't always come from complexity. Sometimes it's found in a humble dish that jiggles when you nudge it with a spoon. Poor man's cake, simple butter cake. Poor man's cake is one of those desserts that perfectly captures the ingenuity of Depression-era kitchens. When butter, eggs, and milk were scarce or saved for special occasions, thrifty home bakers found ways to make do without them, creating cakes that relied on pantry staples, yet still managed to taste celebratory. Sometimes called war cake or depression cake, this simple butter cake earned its name, not because it was flavorless, but because it turned frugality into something surprisingly indulgent. The method was refreshingly straightforward. Flour, sugar, and baking powder formed the base, while water or leftover coffee stood in for milk. Shortening or even rendered lard often replaced butter, lending richness without breaking the budget. A splash of vanilla, a pinch of cinnamon, or grated nutmeg, whatever spices were on hand, gave the cake character. Once mixed, the batter was poured into a greased pan and baked until golden, filling the kitchen with a sweet aroma that felt like a small luxury during lean times. Families loved poor man's cake because it required no special ingredients, yet still delivered comfort. It was the dessert you could whip up on a Tuesday evening, share with neighbors, or bring to church socials without spending a dime you didn't have. In households with children, it was often topped with a dusting of powdered sugar or a thin glaze made from water and confectioner's sugar, proving that a little sweetness went a long way when money was tight. Today, this humble cake has found new life among nostalgic bakers and those seeking simpler desserts. Its light crumb and mild flavor pair beautifully with seasonal fruit or a scoop of ice cream, but it needs nothing more than a cup of coffee to feel complete. One slice carries the quiet story of resilience, a reminder that even in hard times, people found ways to make life and dessert a little sweeter. Chipped beef on toast. Chipped beef on toast is one of those dishes that walks a fine line between comfort food and culinary legend, remembered fondly by some and dreaded by others. Born out of military mess halls in the early 20th century and popularized during World War II, this simple meal became a staple not just for soldiers, but also for families back home looking for affordable, filling options during the lean years of the Depression and wartime rationing. At its core, chipped beef on toast was nothing more than thin slices of salted, dried beef, sometimes called dried beef or beef in a jar, simmered in a white cream gravy and poured generously over toast. The salty meat rehydrated in the sauce, infusing the gravy with a savory punch that clung to every bite of bread. The preparation was fast and frugal, requiring little more than flour, milk, and fat to create the sauce. For many families, it was a lifesaver on mornings when protein was scarce, but appetites were big. In military circles, the dish earned an infamous nickname, SOS, short for stuff on a shingle, or a less polite variation, reflecting the mixed feelings of those who ate it daily. Yet for countless veterans returning home, chipped beef on toast carried nostalgia, a link to comrades, and a taste of a shared experience. Civilian households adopted it too, often serving it as an inexpensive weekend breakfast or quick supper. Today, chipped beef on toast is rarely seen outside diners or vintage cookbooks, replaced by flashier brunch fare. But for those who grew up with it, one bite is an instant time machine. Soft toast soaked in creamy gravy, the saltiness of the beef balanced by the richness of the sauce. It's a dish that reminds reminds us how humble ingredients, when handled with care, can feed both body and memory. Proof that even mess hall food can find a place in the heart. Potato pancakes with applesauce. Potato pancakes with applesauce is a dish that bridges old world tradition and Depression-era practicality, finding its way onto American tables through immigrant kitchens and staying there because it was cheap, filling, and surprisingly elegant for something so humble. At its heart, it's a recipe born of thrift, a way to transform a few potatoes and an onion into something golden and crisp, then pair it with the sweet tang of applesauce to create a meal greater than the sum of its parts. The method begins with grated potatoes, often squeezed dry in a clean towel to keep them from turning soggy, a little grated onion, an egg if you had one, and just enough flour or breadcrumbs to bind it all together completed the batter. Fried in shimmering fat, lard, bacon grease, or vegetable oil depending on the kitchen, the pancakes emerge crisp at the edges and tender inside, each one a study in contrast between hearty and delicate. Applesauce was the perfect partner, and not just for flavor. In many homes, apples were among the few fruits stored through winter, turned into sauce that lasted months in cellars or jars. The tart sweetness cut through the richness of the fried potatoes, adding a brightness that made the dish feel almost celebratory. It was served hot for supper, as a side to roast meats if fortune allowed, or as a standalone meal on leaner nights when potatoes were the main attraction. Today, potato pancakes with applesauce are often tied to Jewish Hanukkah celebrations or nostalgic diner menus, but their Depression-era popularity speaks to their universal appeal. They're proof that comfort food doesn't require abundance, just creativity, a skillet, and the good sense to pair crispy with sweet. One bite transports you back to kitchens where nothing was wasted, and every meal, no matter how simple, was made to feel special. Tomato gravy and biscuits. Tomato gravy and biscuits is one of those quietly iconic dishes that doesn't get the recognition it deserves outside the South and Depression-era cookbooks. While sausage gravy hogs the spotlight today, tomato gravy was once just as common, a thrifty way to stretch a harvest and turn inexpensive ingredients into something that felt like a full meal. At its simplest, it was exactly what it sounded like. Ripe tomatoes stewed down into a silky sauce, thickened slightly and poured over a plate of hot, tender biscuits. The dish emerged in homes where meat was scarce, but gardens were generous. Tomatoes, fresh in summer or canned in winter, were simmered with fat, saved from bacon or salt pork, seasoned with salt, pepper, and sometimes a pinch of sugar to balance their acidity. A bit of flour transformed the juices into gravy, and if milk was available, it mellowed the sharpness into something almost creamy. Meanwhile, biscuits, often made from scratch or with a mix like Bisquick, baked until golden and fluffy, ready to soak up every drop. Tomato gravy and biscuits wasn't just a breakfast food. It worked any time of day. Farm families might serve it for supper alongside greens or fried potatoes, while city households relied on it as a budget-friendly meal that didn't feel meager. For children, it was often their first taste of gravy and became a comfort food they remembered long after leaving home. Today, tomato gravy is something of a hidden gem, overshadowed by flashier brunch staples. But for those who rediscover it, there's a quiet magic in that first bite. The sweetness of tomatoes mingling with the flaky biscuit, the memory of kitchens where thrift met creativity. It's a dish that proves resourcefulness can be as delicious as indulgence, and that humble pantry staples, in the right hands, can taste like your comfort. If you enjoyed this trip down memory lane, and maybe found a recipe worth reviving in your own kitchen, don't forget to give this video a like, share it with someone who loves old-fashioned cooking, and subscribe for more forgotten